So the title of my paper is Against Survival, Global Population, Bare Earth, and the Biopolitics of Sustainable Development. And it is not a paper in Canadian literature. This paper is inspired by a statement that appears in Our Common Future, the 1987 popularly published report by the World Commission on Environment and Development, and from which we get the paradigm of sustainable development. It is a quotation from Mr. Ayoto Kranaki, an indigenous man who spoke by an interpreter to the World Commission in Sao Paulo, Brazil, at one of the Commission's 11 public hearings, held between March 1985 and February 1987. Listed only as an unnamed speaker from the floor in the report, here is his quoted statement. "You talk very little about life. You talk too much about survival. It is very important to remember that when the possibilities for life are over, the possibilities for survival start. And there are peoples here in Brazil, especially in the Amazon region, who still live. And these peoples that still live don't want to reach down to the level of survival." Kranaki's comments are interesting for several reasons. To start, Kranaki reminds us that survival was the organizing thread of mid-20th century environmentalism. From the popular 1948 book, The Road to Survival, by US ecologist William Bach, which historians Libby Robin, Strecker Sorlin, and Paul Ward see as a crucial milestone in the emergence of the concept of the environment as overarching term to describe an array of troubling problems, from soil erosion and deforestation to rapid population increases. So from the Road to Survival to the 1945 bombs that inaugurated the nuclear era, which raised fears first that no one would survive a nuclear war, and then in the wake of research into the after effects of radiation on humans, plants, and animals, to terrors about the possibilities of surviving and coping with the uncertain aftermath. And on through the heyday of overpopulation alarm in the 1960s and 70s, epitomized by Paul Ehrlich's popular 1968 book, The Population Bomb, which implicitly equated population increases with the total devastation of nuclear war. To the 1972 Club of Rome report on coming resource scarcities, and the inaugural 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. The first point of the Stockholm Declaration situates its call for environmental protection in the context of, quote, the enjoyment of basic human rights, even the right to life itself, end quote. And the two reports associated with that conference both frame their discussions around survival. The Friends of the Earth publication is subtitled, quote, An Introduction to the Politics of Survival, while Barbara Ward and René Dubois' Only One Earth, commissioned by the conference secretariat, states that, quote, the charge of the UN to the conference was clearly to define what should be done to maintain the Earth as a place suitable for human life. Placing an issue in the context of survival would appear to make it urgent, foundational, and global. Yet in the lead up to Stockholm, Third World representatives insistently refused its apparent universalism, suggesting the environment was a problem of an industrial economy, the many benefits of which were at last in sight for decolonizing nations. Sustainable development is the political framework that reconciled these positions. largely in showing the mutually reinforcing interconnections between impoverishment and environmental deterioration, and in endorsing the aspirational line of development over the threat of survival. This negotiated compromise is worth remembering as we see recurring apocalyptic rhetoric and climate change advocacy in popular representation. But Kronacki does not endorse development over survival. It may seem that Kronacki's statement that he and others do not want to have to reach down to the level of survival and instead still live shares the environmentalist sentiments of Vogt and Ehrlich, both of whom represented ecological calamity as threatening a loss of humanity and civilization, a reduction to a form of life not worth living. Vogt, for instance, writes, unless, quote, man readjusts his way of living to the imperatives imposed by the limited resources of his environment, we may as well give up hope of continuing civilized life. Like Gadarene swine, we shall rush down a war-torn slope to a barbarian existence in the blackened rubble. But Kronacki rejects the rhetoric of survival altogether, hence my title, Against Survival. He argues that the very use of survival rhetoric already marks the end of life, for it reduces life to its most basic biological form. And here we have the category of Zoe, which Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben draw from Aristotle, and which Agamben terms bare life. In Agamben's formulation, quote, the fundamental categorical pair of Western politics is not that of friend-enemy, but that of bare life, political existence, Zoe bios, exclusion, and inclusion. Kronacki's indigenous critique of international environmental discourse does not mention the political, which is the key point for Arendt, and which lies at the heart of Agamben's account of bare life as a category enacted to the act of political exclusion and exception to the law. But exclusion, the casting outside of the realm of human community, is strikingly the very term Kronacki uses in his full statement to the Commission as recorded in the archival hearing transcripts. And I quote from them here. He says, we want to have a full life, continue having a full life, and not the life of animals, of excluded beings. We want the life of Indian peoples of the Amazon region. Kronacki's description of Indian peoples living a full life and not excluded beings can be appreciated as a rejoinder to colonial and international development discourses and environmental rhetoric like William Vogt's that figured the indigenous, at times in conjunction with animality, as outside humanity, civilization, and modernity. It is definitely a rejection of modernization paradigms that equate the good life with industrial development, because it is prefaced as a response to earlier discussions about the serious life-threatening problems of urban industrial pollution in Brazil. So, first, we have survival as a universalist environmental framework that did not consider how it potentially left whole populations permanently excluded from one compelling project of the good life. Second, we have survival as an empty life, an inhuman life. And third, we have the way in which this inhuman life, this life as empty, is produced through both of the dominant versions of development. Development as industrial modernization, and development as a refraction of the colonial, civilized, savage temporal binary, in which people described as under or undeveloped are figured as having an empty present and need development to move towards a full future. This emptiness is retroactively constructed by way of the narrative of modernization, which, as Deepesh Chakrabarty has shown, renders the past as what is to be overcome or left behind en route to improvement, just as from the 18th century improvement discourse onwards, the earth itself is taken to be waste until transformed into productive land. Indeed, Vogt's imagined environmental apocalypse repeats this association by depicting a future of blackened rubble, or bare earth, on which there can only exist bare life. By following Krenaki's stance against survival, I want us to consider how such environmental representations of bare earth are structured around exclusion and exception. As bare earth, a physical place is depicted as if without sustenance, and hence any possible biocultural meanings and practices. The terrain might be earth, but does not count as productive, and as such the lives lived there do not count as fully human. It is this link between life emptied of its cultural and spiritual fullness and land emptied of its cultural and spiritual fullness that concerns the indigenous opponents at the World Commission hearings. Another indigenous speaker, Mr. Alton Krenak, speaking of how he was born in exile because a Brazilian state mining company displaced his entire community in the 1940s, links ecological degradation and the injustice of state appropriation and colonization of indigenous lands to modernity's empty grid of time and space. He describes how the state, quote, sees the planet that we live upon as if it were a chessboard where people just move things around. He argues instead that, quote, we cannot consider the planet as something isolated from the cosmic, and here I'll quote at length from his statement. When the government took our land in the valley of Rio Doce, they wanted to give us another place somewhere else. But the state, the government, will never understand that we do not have another place to go. The only possible place for the Krenak people to live and to reestablish our existence, to speak to our gods, to speak to our nature, to weave our lives, is where our God created us. It is useless for the government to put us in a very beautiful place, in a very good place with a lot of hunting and a lot of fish. The Krenak people, we continue dying, and we die insisting that there is only one place for us to live. The dehumanization of survival discourse unwittingly repeats the decontextualization of modernization discourse in both its cultural and ecological dimensions. To talk in terms of survival is not only to strip human life of its humanity, and to presume that certain people have already been reduced to inhuman life, but also to strip nature of its more than human, animate, and cosmic fullness. This blackened rubble may seem merely a rhetorical gesture of what may happen, which we wish to avoid, but implicit within its imagination is the establishment of certain ecologies as states of exception located outside living community. They are nothing, wastelands, bare earth, and anything becomes permitted there. Most crucially, survival discourse disturbingly abandons the realm of the political in its fixation on biological life. There is no place for Alton Krenak's detailed history of state-led environmental destruction in the road to survival, nor frankly in the World Commission's report. And to appreciate this fixation on biological life, we have to see how survivalist environmentalism emerged from early 20th century population discourse, which linked new catastrophic concerns about food production and growing soil infertility with eugenic concerns about the quality of the life of a population. As Alison Bashford outlines in her 2014 history, Global Population, there are a wide range of population and eugenics positions in the early 20th century, many of which were cosmopolitan rather than nationalist in formation, and these are significant for understanding the contours of mid to late 20th century environmental thought. On the eugenics, or quality of population side, there was a concern that without available empty space to send the surplus, indeed the economically and socially surplus populations of Europe, then the quality of those nations would decline. Here, she argues, is the emergence of a planetary imagination based on declining availability of space for people in what was coming to be seen as a closed world at the end of the imperial era. This notion of the Earth as a limited closed system is foundational for the Stockholm and Club of Rome documents of the 1970s. Even, indeed, the ecological footprint tool of the early 1990s remains within this framework. Added to the closed spatial world, Bashford suggests, was a new ecologically framed attention to life and to space as living. Soil, she emphasizes, was for the first time, and I'll quote here, comprehended as itself living, as organic, part of the newly minted biosphere, another term of the period. She writes, and I'm sorry, I will quote at length from her here, thinking about soil as biopolitical also suggests the life that was at the core of classical geopolitics. To connect soil science to Lebensraum is not my interpretive move. This is Bashford saying this. It was a connection that historical actors themselves made. Well-known political ecologists such as Fairfield Osborne, William Boat, Julian Huxley, and Paul Sears picked up this idea when they wrote of living landscapes and living earth, end quote. And it might be worth pausing here to point out that this is the very set of thinkers featured in Robin Sorlin and Ward's History of Environment, this set of thinkers. And then third, this is continuing Bashford's argument on the Malthusian quantity of population side. The new biology of generational breeding led to new mathematical models of possible food supply shortages, given the declining availability of natural sources of the fertilizer nitrogen. She writes, quote, the soil food population cadence explains why American ecologist William Boat, quoting on the Black and Rubble, why he became simultaneously a leading figure in the Planned Parenthood Federation of America on the one hand, and the Conservation Foundation on the other. I provide this detailed overview in order to take up Bashford's point that we might see global environmentalism as a biopolitical formation that approaches people as populations inhabiting living spaces. A genealogy, I suggest, is overshadowed by American-centric histories that tell the story of environmentalism as the politics of nature conservation. The World Commission on Environment and Development actually marks the end of population discourse as a prominent driving theme in environmental thought and policy, due to the insistent opposition by third world commissioners who felt that population rhetoric largely targeted third world peoples for population reduction and fertility management. Hence, in the official report of the World Commission, human dignity and human rights, rather than population, were foregrounded in order to find international common ground on environmental challenges, as Iris Borley has detailed in her history of the Commission. Indeed, I think the Commission's report featured the quotations from the two Indigenous speakers I began with in order to demonstrate and endorse this turn to quality of life over quantity of life. And yet, as Kornacki's critique makes clear, an emptiness remains at the heart of this apparent concern with quality of life. And Alison Bashford helps us see that it's not so easy to disentangle quantity of life from quality of life arguments, or even human life from animal life, from earth life, because these combine to form global environmentalism as the management of populations in living space. Concomitantly, the production of quality of life through population management was also foundational to the development discourse of the mid to late 20th century, in which development was the solution to a problem defined at the level of basic need. As Arturo Escobar has argued, development as a cultural struggle whereby people strive to articulate and bring into being their own visions of a good life, was depoliticized and decontextualized into a form of biopolitical technical knowledge practiced on economies, populations, and bodies. So while early critics of sustainable development denounced its instrumentalization of non-human life and expansive global managerialism, we might rather say that sustainable development is an assemblage of the already existing biopolitical formations of ecological management and development. Finally, I want to add a further layer to complicate these contestations over life at the World Commission by suggesting that ultimately the political demands made at the public hearings for sustaining context-rich qualities of life were overshadowed by the emergent spectacle of life as biodiversity. Beginning with the influential 1986 United States National Forum on Biodiversity in Washington, D.C., the catchphrase biodiversity went from awkward American neologism to international convention in just 6 years, coinciding with the work of the Brundtland Commission. Biological diversity is almost completely absent from the Brundtland Commission's preliminary materials and the public hearings. It appears in the report as a chapter on species and ecosystems written for the Commission by the American Tropical Ecologist Norman Myers, and then becomes protected under one of the key conventions signed at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, which is the culmination of the Brundtland Commission's work. What's important about the framework of biodiversity is that it enabled a shift in conservation priorities from what was known as charismatic megafauna, like the WWF's famous panda icon, to life itself, as evident in entomologist E.O. Wilson's influential 1984 memoir, Biophilia, or Love of Life. It was this shift in conservation from charismatic megafauna in order to safeguard evolutionary processes and potentialities. Paradoxically, Wilson's insistence on diversity of life, on the singularity of biological differences, involves an erasure of singularity and heterogeneity, as Derrida has argued with regard to the category of the animal, since as life, one individual readily substitutes for another and one species for another, thereby facilitating the convergence of biodiversity with commodification of living creatures and lively images, and the commodification of biodiversity loss in the explosion of popular representations of fragile and vanishing tropical rainforests in the late 1980s, the very areas our two Indigenous speakers came to the Commission about. In the face of rapid species extinction, environmental rhetoric and aesthetics seem to turn even more feverishly to life, to dazzling spectacles of lively nature, so that we media audiences will know what we are losing, what we are putting to death. Indeed, though it can be easy to mock at times the virtual nature that animates media screens, it often seems impossible to critique an environmentalism based on appreciation for life. Life itself seems to be at stake in the contemporary period. But when biodiversity is what appears to be life itself, life at its most vibrant, generative, and productive, it makes life something else, located elsewhere than in the subject and in the futures that ecologically embedded people might want to bring into being. And in the era since the World Commission, the charismatic flourishing of biodiversities across our proliferating screens, though declining in the biosphere, has been eerily mirrored by an explosion in new forms of bare life, such as the famine spectacles of the 1980s or the asylum seekers of the new millennium, marooned outside the political communities shaping their futures. Thank you.